Our fourth episode of the State of Cloud Native. Today we've got Matt Roark and Mike Petersen hosting. I'll go ahead and give people a few minutes to join, but I will comment on our background we have right now. So background is ArgoCon. So we'll have more information about that at the end of the stream. I'll give you some info about us and what the event is and who all is going to be there. But welcome to the fourth one. Welcome, Matt. How are you doing today?
Howdy. Doing great.
Awesome.
Just got wrapped up with a hackathon internally. Was excited to present my project, and I think there were a lot of other exciting projects as well. So it was a great time.
What did you end up working on? Or can
I
you
worked
can you
on
talk about it?
it was a command line utility for one of our APIs internally that we use to manage all of our clusters and sort of the over clusters and everything. So I think it's something that will hopefully be really useful to the support team.
Did you write it in? So you write command line. Did you write it in Go, or what did you use? So what are you getting into?
Yeah, these days everything I write's in Golang.
Okay.
I used to write in Python, but I've seen the way, and Go binaries are just much more efficient, easier to deal with.
Did you use a specific library to create the CLI, or?
There were a few libraries I had to leverage. There was OpenStack libraries. We still use Keystone authentication, and I needed to craft some tokens. There's, of course, the Kubernetes client library that you have to leverage. And I think there are a few for things like formatting as well. There's a tables library. I come from a background of OpenStack, so I like table formatted command line
Yes.
output. So I wanted it to look like that, and so I went and found a library that could do that. So that was also something that
I think one of the common ones too is Cobra, right? Like some people use Cobra for the CLI to get it started,
yeah,
so it's a little bit easier to template out.
for the CLI wrapper, I did use Cobra.
Oh, awesome.
That seems to be really common. There's some pitfalls with that, one of which includes some pre-execution stuff, but I won't go too much into that.
So we got Jay Gavin Ray saying Matt Roark for the win.
I
All
appreciate
right,
that.
so let's go ahead and get started then. So let's dive into what was your first job in tech? How did you get started with tech work, and what were you doing, and what did you like about it?
So I think it was around 2014. I started as a junior system administrator at HostGator. And I primarily started out doing phone support for folks' websites, but I eventually moved on to doing chats. It involved doing about 4 chats at once, so it was a really busy day overall. You could take anywhere from 80 to over 100 chats a day. But you also gained a lot of exposure there to a lot of Linux issues that you wouldn't otherwise, just dealing with all of the at the time, with everything being so monolithic, you're dealing with these shared servers with everyone and their home directories running on the same server, having to mitigate runaway processes and rogue processes, and people's WP engine sites getting hacked and having to be restored. So,
So you're doing chats there and chats on the side. So you're sitting there talking to people on like Jabber and everything too at the same time. You're just chatting away with everybody.
yeah, I mean, after a while, I started to come into an L2 position, still doing chats. And at that point, you would have to help other people internally while also keeping up with your own 4 chats that are going on. And any of those can be a multitude of issues, from the technical issues I described to billing to whatever it may be, right? You're dealing with just 4 different people all asking you for something, and you have to be prepared. So
you're great at context switching, I would say.
yes,
Right? Like you enjoy
yeah.
the. Some people might be like, "Oh, that's too much stuff going on," but you're like, "Oh, I'm bored if I don't have enough stuff going on." So you have to have like all these different things you can think about for a couple minutes at a time, and then move on to the next thing.
In a way, yes. I think I do sometimes miss being that busy, but at the same time, I don't. You know what I mean? It's sort of interesting environment to push yourself that much. But I certainly felt like I grew my skill set with the sort of multitude of issues that I was dealing with. So.
All right, so you're starting out with Linux, you're troubleshooting Linux servers, and then where do you move on to next? Is that when you move to OpenStack? Is that where you went
So
afterwards?
yeah, after that, I went to HPE, and they were doing the HPE Helion public cloud, and that was backed by OpenStack, and so that was sort of my first exposure to OpenStack. it was something you'd heard of the cloud a lot at that point, but nobody really knew. And so it was interesting getting in there and just diving deep into that and getting certified. So I spent some time there doing both the public cloud, and then as they transitioned into the private cloud and learning how to do OpenStack deployments and all of that sort of stuff in the background. So yeah,
So
from Linux to cloud, primarily
and
with and virtualization, like introduction to virtualization in general.
and then after that, you moved over to Kubernetes. So you moved over to Platform 9 and did a little bit of OpenStack troubleshooting, and then you slowly like ramped up on Kubernetes. I won't say slowly. You quickly ramped up on Kubernetes, and now you're mostly troubleshooting Kubernetes stuff. Or what would you say the mix is now?
Yeah, I'd say primarily these days it's majority Kubernetes. A lot of folks are starting to migrate into container native workloads and sort of adopt that over the virtual machine approach. So while there is still some of that going on in terms of virtual machines, a lot of folks have moved towards the containers. So that's primarily it these days. Although, of course, I have to plug that you can still run virtual machines in Kubernetes with the KubeVirt functionality, which I know is something that Platform 9 has introduced recently as
So
sort of
talking about KubeVirt, how close is it to OpenStack, and do you enjoy kind of going back and being like, oh, these are like some of the issues I used to troubleshoot with libvirt, so I can do this again.
I think that I'm excited that we have just one platform where you have both your workloads versus having that sort of split brain situation going on. Although I think that there's still some things that likely are going to come to maturity with KubeVirt still, to where OpenStack has been around a long, long time, and it may not be there quite yet. But I think that overall, when you're thinking about if you haven't already started, you might as well. I mean, A, you might as well just make it container native and just do that. But B, if you really have to, you might as well put it in your Kubernetes cluster and just work with the limitations there until you can work to address that sort of code migration. So
I think some of the nice things about that is if you're moving over from something like OpenStack or something that uses cloud images and not like just templates, maybe like with VMware, it's easy to move to KubeVirt because they just use the same images, right? Like you just have to figure out storage, which is a little bit different. And then like when you're troubleshooting, you're not going into like 50 different services like OpenStack. You're just looking at the logs from the container. Um, I've had fun with KubeVirt. Like it's fun going back and just downloading cloud images, which I haven't done in forever because I've been using containers for such a long time now. It's great. So let's move on. So what's keeping you in technical troubleshooting and support, and like what do you enjoy more about that, like versus maybe moving into something like straight engineering? Like do you like working with customers more, or
I like solving issues in general. I always think that it's great to have a challenge, and I think that the satisfaction that you get from helping people is definitely something that I enjoy. So it can be a bit of, I like working on issues in the background, but I do also still like helping people. And then the problems are always, unique problems are always interesting. So
you get wrapped
uh,
up in the hackathons and you get to work on a project for like a little bit longer period of time. You're like, oh, this is fun too. But then you're like going back to just, I'm kind of bored of that after like a week. Maybe I want to go back to like random stuff coming in, or
yeah, I mean, that's sort of the principal engineering role that I take on the support team, is creating a lot of automation and tooling that the team needs in order to be successful. So that's a lot of what I end up doing with my time, is things like the CTL tool that I was describing, so they can leverage that in order to more efficiently do their jobs. So um, yeah, I think it's definitely a mix of a lot of things.
all right, here's a question. So when you started troubleshooting Kubernetes to now, what type of maturity do you see in the environment for like customers? Has it gone from like more so asking about like how to configure like a YAML and make sure that the settings are correct to like more complex issues now? Like new customers coming in, are they like day one questions are much different than what you saw like 2 or 3 years ago?
I guess it depends. I think that folks are at different points of maturity with container native workloads. And so some of them are kind of just coming into Kubernetes. Some of them have been dealing with it for a while. Some have even come from OpenStack and migrated to Kubernetes, and they're starting to get used to that. So I'd say I definitely see all ends of the spectrum.
What So where has the difficulty shifted moving from virtualization troubleshooting to Kubernetes? Like the virtualization, you're more so probably troubleshooting the services and stuff like that, but in Kubernetes now you're troubleshooting other things. Like what do you think's the difference, or what's the biggest difference you've seen?
Yeah, I think a lot with the virtualization OpenStack side of things that we dealt with a lot of networking issues, right? If anyone's familiar with OpenStack, you know that Neutron is complicated to deal with. And there's only a few people who are really experts with being able to debug it when it comes to, OVS especially. I think with Kubernetes, a lot more of the issues you see are things like reconciliation issues with the some of the controllers that are running on there, things like garbage collection, for images that are getting downloaded, not pod evictions, things that's not something that normally sort of happen in a uh, VM environment where if things got too backed up that they would just start kicking off workloads on other nodes. And I think that sometimes that can be an unexpected event for folks that aren't as familiar with some of the default thresholds that are in place with Kubernetes today. So it really all depends. I can't say that there aren't networking issues with Kubernetes and storage issues as well, right? There's definitely that share of things when it comes to things like device mapper as well. But
You think like the oversubscribed stuff is a little bit different with containers too. If you're more so optimizing the servers themselves instead of like virtualization, you're expecting people maybe to use it at different times. Now with containers, it's like they're always going. So maybe like resource allocation and requests and over subbing are a bit different now. Maybe that creates some issues too. I don't know.
yeah, I think it's at least more visible to folks when they're defining in the YAML what limits and requests there should be versus with virtual machines when it's just the hypervisor has some defined ratio limit, and it's like, okay, and you just keep scheduling things until the host starts underperforming or tipping over. So I think overall that's handled a lot better in the Kubernetes world.
So you're not so I'd say you're like SRE type knowledge, but you don't really own the environments. Like a lot of it's customer environments. If you were a customer, what would keep you up at night about Kubernetes, and what would you be worried about, like when you're going to sleep, getting woken up at like 2 a.m.? Like what kind of issues?
I guess I really would just worry about some of the issues I'm talking about in terms of pod evictions and ensuring that there aren't some runaway cron jobs happening in the middle of the night that are scheduled, which are spawning all these jobs and then causing. We've had one situation where there's still device mapper being used in a really old cluster and images were being downloaded, which would fill up the disk, but garbage collection didn't run. And so, things would get scheduled on there, but they weren't working. And so you just start one thing after another can definitely cascade unexpectedly. And so I think that that's, again, why it's important to make sure you have the requests and limits set appropriately on the workloads, though.
Have you ran into any customer issues like related to that kind of stuff? Like, everything's broken. What's going on? And you've had to hop on. You're like, well, it's this, and you kind of describe that to them, and then like how often does it happen after like you kind of work on like doing limits and setting requests? Does it is it just keeps on happening because like maybe things are growing too fast for them, or
There are tweaks that have to be made. At some point, you have to grow your infrastructure, but then also you have to think about other things aside from just implementing just limits and requests. Right there's some other complicated methodologies, including the pod topology spread, for example, being one of those things that you just have to kind of mess around with until you get the right balance for your workload and the frequency at which you're scheduling those workloads as well.
gotcha. We got a question, and then I have a follow up too. So Jay Gavin saying that Platform 9 provides a managed service and gives users a single pane of glass. So when you're managing bare metal, you have to deal with multiple levels of abstraction on the network virtualization layers, and in case of Kubernetes, all the above. So we take some of the burden off of that. So what tools and general recommendations have you personally found useful when having to deal with all of that abstraction? So I guess are you using tools to troubleshoot this kind of stuff, or like additional things, or
I see. When it comes to additional tooling, I'd say in terms of troubleshooting, there hasn't been a whole lot of external tooling that we've had to leverage in order to do that. There are some that some open source projects we've explored to get us things like network metrics, trying to map out where requests are going from one pod to another in order to kind of trace that traffic and figure out where the issues may lie. In general, though, in terms of sort of automation tooling, I think that Terraform is one that I've used before too, and we have a Terraform provider that we published in the past that will allow you to sort of create a Platform 9 cluster and manage that from the command line. These days, we are moving towards the PF9 CLI that we have, though, and that is starting to kind of take shape in terms of the replacement for some of that other tooling. So,
Gotcha. So how many customers do you think are running their own CRDs? Like, are they writing? Do you have customers that are writing their own stuff to manage resources internally or externally? And are you troubleshooting that a lot, or helping like give guidance on that?
I don't think a lot of them are writing any sort of custom resource definitions themselves. A lot of folks prefer to go with the tested, validated sort of upstream operators that may be. So a lot of the time, if anything, it'll just be troubleshooting something that has come from upstream that they've wanted to deploy in their environment, but may not be quite working correctly. And that can extend all the way to storage class drivers, right? And the CSI pods that those require to connect to the flash storage backends. And it, so sometimes it can be to where you'll have to sort of dig into that documentation to figure out what you're working with.
What do you think some of the most popular ones are that you've seen, or which ones are you troubleshooting the most? Which ones have the best documentation, and which ones do you wish had better documentation?
I wish I could say that there's one in particular that I'm used to troubleshooting, but at Platform 9, for some reason, it's always been very unique issues that have been dealt with. We, of course, document anything that comes in. That way, if that comes in again, we're able to address that. But I haven't necessarily seen a pattern of any particular bad storage drivers or systems out there that are causing us a whole lot of grief. And I mean, maybe I think that's a good sign for the Kubernetes community, though, that everything is fairly stable.
Are you seeing a lot of Istio and stuff get installed pretty early on, or are you having to troubleshoot issues with that? Like what thing can someone install that has given you the most headache in troubleshooting, that's the most difficult, or took you the most time to spin up on figuring it out?
Again, I don't know if there's one that's most common, but as far as what most folks will go and install when they first launch a cluster or as part of the cluster creation is things like MetalLB, for example, right? If you're running like a Bare OS cluster and you want to have load balancing on premise, then you'll have Keep Alive D that's deployed across X number of master nodes that you have. And networking issues of various sorts can mess with the election cycle for that, particularly at times. And there's been kernel issues related to the VIP just going away suddenly in certain OS particular kernel versions at times. So it can be to where you're dealing with issues like that with various sort of add-ons that are incorporated to the cluster. But
Well, it seems like that project's still being worked on. So even like the base L2 doesn't really seem super HA. Like it just goes through. Does it still go through one node? Like if you've got multiple nodes up, and then like if that node fails, it moves over, or like instead of actually really load balancing between all of them, so you have like a single point. Or at least that's what I saw in the L2 originally. Like I think that the L3 stuff is a little bit better. Like, okay,
yeah.
so here's a trivia question for you that I got. So how does we'll see if you can answer this one. Maybe you probably can. How does load balancing work in Kubernetes? Like what actually, when you set up a load balancing service, how does it pick? Is it round robin? Is it random? Have you looked into IP tables and how it works?
So that's handled by kubeproxy on the nodes, right? They advertise the endpoints that are available for the pods that are scheduled onto those nodes. And then based on those endpoints, it is able to do things like round robin the requests in order to send it, make sure that the traffic is actually sent to the node which has that pod associated with it. And it's not sending it to some other node. So
I think next time we have you on, let's see if we can stump Matt Roark. I think that'll be the next one. So you just have all these questions coming in, like which one is it? All right, let me think. What's next? So Do you have any interesting troubleshooting stories, like something that took you a little bit longer, or like was super interesting that you figured out that maybe not everyone sees when they're running an environment?
In terms of Kubernetes, um, maybe let's circle back to that one. I'll give that a thought in terms of what is the most complicated story I could share with you.
Do you miss RabbitMQ
No.
for OpenStack?
And
Do you miss the
unfortunately,
messaging
that's
queues?
that's that's still around today in some applications. So people still are running that on Kubernetes, and it's still a necessity in some cases. So
What do you think the time to resolution is, or have you noticed a trend in the time of resolution for an OpenStack issue versus a Kubernetes issue, or is there really much difference?
I see. I think when it came to OpenStack, that it depended on which component was affected and just how deep the issue sort of went. In general, though, I'd say that Kubernetes issues can be just a bit easier to solve. I don't know why that is necessarily. I think with OpenStack, there were just a lot more running components that you could run into issues with various sorts. I could also blame it on the fact that OpenStack's written in Python, though. Kubernetes is written in Golang, so it goes back to that.
How much easier is it for troubleshooting Kubernetes to have an environment that matches your customer versus something like OpenStack or a virtualization platform?
So are you talking about in terms of reproduction, like matching the customer environment
Yeah, like
internally?
do you do that for Kubernetes? I know you do that for OpenStack a lot, just because you needed to have something to test on. Are you running Kubernetes environments that are similar to maybe a customer environment with the same like setup to where you can troubleshoot it on your own, or are you like doing more live troubleshooting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of both, right? So we do have our own internal environments, and we try and install everything that we can to just sort of test out everything that you possibly could want. But I wouldn't say there are many as needed particular setups as with OpenStack, where it's like, okay, I need this storage driver with this configured this way. Kubernetes is a lot more agnostic, perhaps, in terms of that. So I think that if someone's facing an issue with something in particular, deploying an app for some reason, then it's easy to kind of, okay, I'll just go and apply that same YAML manifest to my environment, and see if it works. With OpenStack, you could have some corrupted image, which is hard to reproduce. Kubernetes, it's like you've got to define YAML. It's easy just to say, go do that in this other cluster and see if it works the same way. So,
Do you think
but
there's
yeah,
a sorry, go ahead.
no, sorry. I was going to say for some of the on-premise work that we're doing, there are times where, of course, you're still going to have to go and dive into the cluster yourself, and you may not know what is deployed there necessarily until you're at the point of troubleshooting it. So it just depends.
How different is the community for OpenStack versus like Kubernetes? Is it easier to get answers and help from Kubernetes? I know it's not quite as old, so maybe it's harder to find answers sometimes. Have you had to engage with the community to figure something out before?
Yeah, I mean, I've had to engage with the community on open source projects like Cobra, which I was using, and some of the limitations I was talking about, such as flag validation during pre-execution phases. And I think that folks are generally responsive on GitHub for those projects. I think for OpenStack, you mainly have to rely upon Launchpad bug reports and hoping that somebody is knowledgeable enough to and wanted to respond to you. Um, but
I think
generally, there are only a few companies at the time really paying folks in order to be those sort of subject matter experts on those components.
I think that's you give up some of the like the open infra stuff. Like they're super all about open source stuff. So you're gonna have Launchpad and Garrett and stuff like that. Whereas like Kubernetes was more Google stuff, and they just went right to GitHub to where it's a little bit more accessible to people probably than even signing up and submitting code is easier for the Kubernetes related projects than it is for OpenStack, which has like this huge amount of like reading you have to do to even understand like Garrett and Launchpad. Maybe it's easier now that I haven't contributed in a while. But I say like even like Knative, like everyone's super helpful. There's Slacks you can jump into. People answer questions. Like it's fun contributing, I think, to the Kubernetes community. And I guess being Golang and stuff like that, it's a little bit more new and exciting. Um, have
I,
you?
I guess that's the case. I guess that must be.
Have you contributed to any of the Kubernetes projects or anything, or have you been looking into contributing to anything or contributing back
I,
what you're working on now?
I would certainly love to contribute to something. I just need to find the right place to do it. I think that usually it sort of comes to me when I'm working on something. I'm like, oh, I need this, and then I try and do something very unique with that, which doesn't work. And I feel the necessity to sort of contribute back to that if it is a bug. I love answering other people's unanswered Stack Overflow questions, where it's like similar to what I ran into the other day, where I'm like, they couldn't figure out how to generate a kube config in Golang correctly, or in order to sort of deconstruct it and then reconstruct it. And I was like, okay, like a year later, I figured this out. Like, here's, hopefully they still needed that answer, but that could be satisfying.
I think that's part of your enjoying interacting with customers and other people and solving issues. But then also, I think OpenStack and getting into the open source stuff really instills this. I need to share this back. Like it's anything I work on too. Yeah, I want to submit on GitHub in a public community area so someone can use it. Right, like be a little bit helpful because otherwise, like I think everyone's kind of getting tired of everything being closed off completely. Like it's nice to be able to contribute back.
Oh yeah.
Let's see, what do I got next? So what's your okay? So now that you say you're well, actually, let's see if anyone has any questions. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and post them. We can I can ask Matt if you want to post them on LinkedIn or on YouTube or Twitch, whichever one you're watching on. I'll be watching to see if there's any questions, and I can pose them to Matt. But let's say what's your now that you're saying you're doing more Kubernetes and OpenStack stuff. What's your ideal split? Would you enjoy a 50-50 split? Do you like maybe more 75 or 75 Kubernetes, 25 OpenStack, or would you like to get away from OpenStack completely if you could? OpenStack, same virtualization. Let's just generalize virtualization. I just know that your background is more OpenStack.
It feels like I'm gonna forever be nostalgic about working with OpenStack, and so I don't want to completely go away from it. But I am more excited these days to work with Kubernetes. So it's probably more like a 15% OpenStack sort of situation, 85% Kubernetes. But it'll always have a place in my heart. We'll see. I'm sure that a decade later it'll still be in use, even though that's hard to believe.
It'll probably be in more use than it was in the first 5 years, right? Like because people will
Yep.
finally start adopting it. Oh, we're going to move to virtualization, and then I don't know what's after Kubernetes. I'm hoping Kubernetes is the thing for a while, right? Just because it's like it's more of a platform where you can create your own things, which is awesome, right? Like so, like have you had any interesting ideas about creating your own CRD or like something that you would like to have added for maybe even just for like Platform 9 or something like that? Or say you're running your own Kubernetes environment, what would you work on that would be kind of fun for that? Or have you messed around with something like Crossplane?
Yeah, so there is a lot of that sort of stuff that we're working on internally right now with regards to sort of creating our own CRDs in order to deploy clusters. For myself, if you had to ask me off the cuff, like what could I do with CRDs, especially I guess with regards to support, I think there are things you could do like today where we pull support bundles. You could certainly include those as an object within the cluster that would allow us to access those. And anything sort of troubleshooting related like that would be good to have. But in terms of other sort of CRDs, no, I haven't really had the necessity for that come up so far.
So are you troubleshooting Argo stuff yet? Are you playing around with
No, not
Argo and
yet. I think we're still ramping up on that, but soon enough here, I think we're going to be dealing with a lot more of that, and I'm excited.
what are you most excited about for Argo? Like just the way it changes some of the deployment stuff, or
I think it's finally good that everyone is wanting to adopt CI/CD. I think it's been too long. Everything should be automated in my eyes, and so nobody should have to deploy clusters by hand. And there shouldn't be any sort of human mistake involved in that either. So I think that having an automated pipeline to sort of build your clusters and manage your resources is a great idea.
so upgrades, right? Like you talking about that too, like automating cluster deployment and upgrades. What benefits do you see with Kubernetes? Like, uh, so I installed OpenStack originally in 2013, and it was Grizzly, and I did an upgrade to Havana, and I broke everything because I couldn't do a successful database migration. What what do you see as a benefit for using Kubernetes over some of the older things with upgrades? Maybe OpenStack's easier to upgrading now, but like, do you think Argo is gonna make it easier to upgrade for people too? They can just like define what they want and they'll upgrade, or like, do you think they'll be doing upgrades in place? I'll let you talk.
For Kubernetes, I think that kubeadm has always been a fairly good tool for admins to use, but I won't say that it's necessarily straightforward to perform an upgrade still, right? There's still 10 or so steps involved in that. And you have to be very careful. Versus automated upgrades where it's all guaranteed to sort of work, and that's what a lot of people find benefit of PMK and always have been for a while, is just that fact that there is a one-click upgrade through the UI, right? You select which version you want to upgrade to, and then you just do it. There's no going to kubeadm and really hoping that you don't mess up the cluster.
And if you
But
run into any issues, you're there, right? Like Matt's here, so you run
yeah,
into anything.
you've
So we
got
got a
24
question.
support. You know that everyone is CKA and or CKS certified, and so all of us definitely know what we're doing when it comes to that. So
So we got another question from Jay Gavin, Ray. So, what are your thoughts on introducing open telemetry alongside Prometheus monitoring for SRE and troubleshooting?
good question, and interesting time to ask that. We're introducing right now the ability to have like an external monitoring system that's hosted on our remote management plane for customers, which will allow them to have all of the telemetry tooling and monitoring that will live outside of their cluster, which has historically been a challenge to solve in terms of, okay, you can deploy Prometheus and Alert Manager, but what happens when your cluster goes away, right? You're not, yes, there is like a dead man sort of alert that will tell you when it's no longer sending metrics, but still you're relying upon things that can go down. So it's good to have that external monitoring. And I think that telemetry and centralized logging are two really useful things to have in terms of troubleshooting. Centralized logging, especially. I remember having to used to log on to 10 different servers to get logs for everything, right?
So what's the time frame for something like an OpenStack upgrade versus a Kubernetes upgrade? So like how long, like if you're planning with a customer to upgrade their OpenStack environment, like what does that entail? Is that like a week or like a couple of days and then like real planning and follow through and you're hands on versus what's a Kubernetes one? And like, are you hands on from the start till it's completely finished? And is it like a day or a couple hours or?
So with most OpenStack upgrades, it could be a couple hours to a day to a week, right? I think it's you're kind of hinting at. It really depended on the environment. But I will say that with the Platform 9 managed OpenStack offering that we had previously, that we were also one of the ones to make it super easy in order to just have the management plane taken from one version to another without you having to worry about sort of upgrading any of those control plane components. And so I think that having taken the burden of having those deployed amongst the host directly versus having it on our remote management plane really made a difference in terms of making that easier and significantly reducing time for upgrades.
Were they
But in
containerized? Was like did Cola take over and like did it all get containerized or no?
No, we did not have a containerized one at that point. It was still a virtualized control plane. But obviously containerized is what we're moved towards today for the PMK side of the world. So, and with regards to Kubernetes, obviously, again, upgrades are fairly seamless. They don't take much time. We generally allocate, you can allocate anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes for it. But you also have to account for how many hosts you have, right? If you have a cluster that has 300 hosts, obviously it's going to take a bit longer, especially depending on the upgrade strategy you choose, right? Which is one of the options that we offer when you perform a cluster upgrade is, do you want to do it sequentially? Do you want to do it as a batch upgrade? Like what percentage of nodes do you want to upgrade at one time? And that will kind of determine how long it takes in order to get through those hosts. So it's really just whatever your tolerance level is.
Do you have a preferred cluster size? Like for having seen so many different clusters and sizes and types, like is there something in the back here? It's like, well, man, this cluster size that's like 25, worker or 25 or so worker nodes is a lot easier to troubleshoot and doesn't have as many problems as something with like 300 or something like that. Or is that just like not really a thing?
I certainly love when folks have more nodes. I think it always makes things easier. Having to try and tweak parameters to squeeze the most out of your existing nodes can always be a bit of a harder task. I think in general, it's more important to pay attention to the number of master nodes that you have, though. I think most people tend to try and just get away with three. I would highly recommend five master nodes for like sort of super production cluster, because if you lose one node or two nodes in a three master cluster, you're going to lose core. You're going to lose that CD quorum. Like if two of your master nodes go down at once in a three master node, you're done. And so it's always important to have that sort of fault tolerance.
Are some of the bigger environments you see using five? Like, is that like the new thing? You just kind of recommend that, like if you're starting to see slowdown in API requests or like just things slowing down in general?
Yeah, some of the bigger environments I've seen do have five master nodes included in them. So I think that that's generally a good number to go with, at least at the minimum, to make sure. But
Now, here's a question for you. What about seven?
seven, I don't know if I've seen seven, but again, more fault tolerance, the better. At the same time, those nodes may be sitting there for a while. So it depends. Do you just have a lot of compute resources at hand? If so, then
Well, once
and
you're thinking about seven, you might want to be thinking about a different cluster, right? Like having multiple clusters.
exactly, you may as well have an AV cluster at that point and use the service mesh, for example, right, to have them running in both clusters. So that probably would be more worth the compute resources instead of it just sitting idle.
All right, so let's go back to most fun troubleshooting story or anything fun that you can think of, or something that was most memorable about like fixing something, or something that you're like, oh man, I'm gonna have to get engineering involved, and then you figured it out and you saved some time.
Yeah, I think there was an issue recently that we were dealing with. It was an issue we were dealing with our bare metal product, and it had to do with the one-time boot setting and IPMI, and it was very complicated to try and sort of troubleshoot because we had these systems that were supposed to be sort of booting off of their hard drive every time that they booted. But it was noticed at one point that when these hosts had gone down, that they pixie booted, and that caused them to sort of not want to come back up, right? And so after much digging and all that, we'd found out that there were some changes between, and again, this sort of goes back to some OpenStack components, which we leverage for that product. Whereas between upgrades, some of the behavior can kind of inadvertently change. I think that Kubernetes has always made it a bit more clear whenever certain API stuff is being deprecated or certain stuff is required. With OpenStack, certainly there can be those gotchas occasionally. So turns out there was some flavor metadata that was missing that would explicitly tell those nodes to boot off of that. But then there was also a sort of fallback mechanism in terms of these netboot files that existed, telling when they would pixie boot, that would tell a provision node, hey, you're already provisioned, you're supposed to boot off the hard drive. And for some reason, that was like no longer existent in the newer version, the environment, and was something removed upstream for who knows why. You always have to go digging into the Git blame and figure out like, okay, someone removed this for this reason, but should it have been kept in for this other reason? And so we end up having to do things in order to try and reconcile that and make it work like it did previously, because obviously folks expect that things will continue to work all the same. So
I think the interesting
yeah,
thing that's happened in troubleshooting is that, right? Like now you need to understand Git. You need to understand what does Git blame mean? Like how do I look up and see what changes have happened? Like you go back, I mean, a lot of stuff you're talking about, you go back, mid 2000s, early 2010s, and that's just like the normal everyday life, right? Like Pixie boot and stuff, like booting off of like an image and stuff like that. Now you're adding in, okay, I need to know how to do that. I need to know networking. I need to know how to do stuff with GitHub. So I need to know a little bit about development. So it's like the person that's in troubleshooting now is a jack of all trades, compared to previously you might just be troubleshooting like your original job, just server issues, right? Like you might not even touch the network stack or anything like that. Have you
I,
enjoyed the slow migration of, not migration, but the slow buildup of learning more and more stuff? Like, do you feel like if you had to go back and tell the beginning, you're at your first job, like what you'd be doing now, do you think you would have overwhelmed yourself? Like maybe that.
I will admit that I think the first job was the most overwhelming. It has been a steady flow of information since then.
Yeah.
But I can't say that, four chats at once is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, go and try it for yourself. Go try and talk to four of your friends at once and see how that goes. It is a lot to deal with mentally,
So you can
and
type over 40 words per minute, is what you're saying.
even up to 100, yeah, even up to 100.
120 or so. Yeah.
Yeah, it and occasionally, I mean, there was one time where there was a data center outage that happened there while I was working at HostGator, and one day there were just hundreds of chats that came in, and you were just having to keep going through them. There's nothing you could do though. That I think that's the worst feeling as a sysadmin. The fact that everyone's like, "I need help. My website's down." You're like, "Sorry, the data center is literally on fire. I can't, I can't do anything to assist you with that right now." So.
Do you feel like now there is stuff that you can do, right? Because you know so much more now. You can do stuff and you can help and you can make, recommendations. Like whereas before you're like, oh, I don't really know. Like maybe someone will fix it for me.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I mean that one compare like a different clientele as well, right? Like in those kind of positions, you're dealing with people who have no idea about websites, about computers, even like they have a website, but they don't know anything about it. Versus the kind of folks that you deal with in the enterprise that obviously are a lot more privy to that knowledge and able to be on the same level. So it can really depend how you present the issue and the
Yeah.
solution.
We got another question from J Gavin Ray. Pixie booting is a really hard problem to solve at scale. Entire companies exist to solve that. Are we working on a bare metal bootstrapping product?
Yeah, we do have the Platform 9 bare metal product that we have right now. And hopefully we can get some more chatter on that soon in terms of more details around that. But
Well,
it
I think
is
we have some
something,
stuff on our docs, but yeah, I don't know like how much information is really out.
yeah, if you go to platform9.com/docs, and I think if you go to /learn as well, there might be some information on there relating to it. Definitely, I agree, though. It is something that it can be really difficult to solve at scale. And we've been working with some retail partners in order to, essentially get them these physical locations bootstrapped with the bare metal agent so that they can manage and deploy things remotely for these systems. So I think that that's a very exciting project.
Well, I think so. My previous life, I actually worked with Matt and did troubleshooting as well, and worked with support. I think some of the scariest times are, yeah, you're hopping on a WebEx and you know everybody that you're working with knows as much or more than you, and you're not really a complete expert. You're just trying to figure it out and solve stuff based on things you've seen before, right? Are you still do you still get a little bit nervous when you're hopping on to try to fix something and you've got like all these super smart people asking you questions and they're like, oh, he's the expert, he's gonna know. Like, do you still feel that like nervousness, or are you a little bit over that yet?
I mean, there's still some pressure to it, but I think overall, I'm a lot more confident these days with the knowledge that I've gained. I feel like I know a lot more things than I did when I started many, many years ago. So,
Are you
I
the Are you the kind of person that if you don't really know something, you go take time and you learn it, so at least you know enough to talk about it before you actually start talking about it?
yeah, I mean, I'm frustrated if I can't figure something out. So I'm definitely going to go look it up and get that figured out if I don't. Because otherwise, I'm just going to be racking my brain over it the whole time. It's the same way when I'm coding. I'll get frustrated. Like, why is this code not working the way that I expect it to? And I'll just continue to go at it until I'm like, okay, finally made it work.
You're
Good.
falling asleep at night and you figure out, oh, this is what I did wrong, or I told that person something wrong. I have to go tell them the right answer. Like,
It's hard to
it's
walk away from it sometimes, but that can
yeah.
also be the right solution because you will just think about it and go back to it. So as much as I'm fairly stubborn when it comes to figuring that stuff out, that can be the better approach.
So I like environments where you can be wrong and you can try to learn things, and then if you're wrong, you're not judged as much, and then people like try to figure it out and they teach you. Like I think those kind of environments are fun to work in.
Oh yeah.
So what would you say to someone who wants to get into supporting and troubleshooting Kubernetes or cloud native stuff like that? Like where would you start? I know like maybe 10 years ago I would tell somebody go try to get a RHCE, and then maybe also like a CCNA. Like where's your starting point now? Like the CKA, or what do you do?
I think the CKA is a good start. It was something that the whole team sort of committed to getting here, and I think that it's helped everyone sort of bolster their knowledge whether they were familiar with Kubernetes or not before, I think it definitely helps you feel a bit more confident that, okay, I know what I'm supposed to know. The CKS was one of the more difficult ones that I took, but I think if you're up for a challenge, that one is certainly one to go for as well. But it is something to where you will be spending the whole time on it. That's
So
for sure. As much practice as I got in, it's still you're working until the last minute to try and get everything done.
would you recommend those two to people that are just starting to work with Kubernetes, even like maybe they've deployed it in their company and they're like, oh, I don't really know, I don't know what to do. So like, would you
You
say
know,
just go do that?
I think there is one introductory course or certificate that the Linux Foundation or the CNCF rather had introduced, where it's sort of below the CKA, right? I think it's like a fundamentals. And I haven't evaluated that one myself, but I think that if you're really unfamiliar with containers, that may be the better place to start. But if you're someone who's worked with Docker containers before, and you're familiar with working with the command line and with command line tools, then I think you should be able to jump into the CKA.
Awesome. I only have one more question for you, and then say thanks for your time. Is there anything else interesting or anything else you want to share? Or
No, I recently just moved down to the San Antonio area here in Texas, so I'm just settling down here in the area. Hope to take some vacation here in the next few months, but yeah, it just not a whole lot going on as I just been trying to settle in. So
awesome, congratulations. Hope you like the area. All right. Now I'm going to talk about ArgoCon, but first I will give some information. If you want to join the conversation, join us on Slack. So slack.platform9.io. We do have a channel. You can sit in general and ask questions, or if you want, you can go to State of Cloud Native. And if you want to actually reach out to me directly and ask questions, I'm at Petersen. So let me go ahead and give some info on ArgoCon since I've got this in the background and I told everybody that I would. So it's going to be in Mountain View, 19th to 20th, 21st. We'll be there, and we're all get together talk about one of our new the Argo CD project. At our booth, you'll find out some more information about some projects and stuff that we're working on. You can check out like Arlon, ARLON. That's actually on GitHub. We are sponsoring the event, so we'll have a booth, and if you want to come talk to us, go ahead. I'll post some more information on this event on LinkedIn, giving you links to where you can register and find out more information about it. But I think that's our time, Matt. Thanks so much for joining. Thank you for your time. Hopefully, I'll have you on here again. Maybe we'll get a couple of the support or engineering people that we can do stump our
yeah,
support or engineering team, so we can learn a little bit from people that may have seen stuff that we haven't.
for
But
sure.
thank you so much. All right, thanks for joining.